In the early 1820s, Denmark Vesey was a familiar face in Charleston, South Carolina. He was a carpenter by trade, a founding member of the city's African Methodist Episcopal congregation, and a free black man in his mid-50s who had bought his own freedom decades earlier. For months, he met quietly with enslaved and free black Charlestonians, laying out a plan for an uprising against the city's slaveholders. On July 2, 1822, he was hanged, not in the chaos of a revolt gone wrong. In a courtroom-ordered execution, weeks after his arrest, before the plan went further than late-night meetings. Under interrogation, he named no one else. He was not the only one to die for it. Over the following month, officials hanged as many as 35 men connected to the plot, sometimes more than a dozen in a single morning, and forced dozens more out of the country. This was not one isolated case of city justice. In Charleston, it was closer to a pattern. The city is routinely ranked among the most haunted in America, alongside Savannah and New Orleans, and almost none of that reputation is folklore. It is a body count on the record in the same blocks tourists walk today. So what happened here, and why doesn't the tour mention it? Charleston sells itself as the Holy City, a name it earned honestly enough. Count the steeples on the skyline and you'll see why. White spires stacked one after another over the rooftops, visible from the harbor before you've set foot on land. Walk Rainbow Row at golden hour, and the townhouses do exactly what they were repainted to do. Pink, yellow, blue, robin's egg green, 13 facades in a row along East Bay Street, each one photographed 1,000 times a week. Walk the Battery at the tip of the peninsula and you get live oaks, harbor views, antebellum mansions with double porches stacked 3 stories high, cannons on the lawn arranged now for framing rather than firing. The French Quarter galleries sit a few blocks north, watercolors of marsh grass and shrimp boats in the windows. Wine poured at the evening walks that happen the first Friday of the month. Horse-drawn carriages move tourists past wrought iron gates at a walking pace built for photographs, the guide narrating architecture and magnolias. After dark, a different set of businesses take over the same streets. Ghost walk companies running lantern-lit tours nightly, rain or shine, guides in period dress leading small groups past graveyards and courtyards, building to a scare that's priced into the ticket. Founded in 1670, the city holds one of the best preserved historic districts in the entire country, and that preservation is the product millions of visitors come to buy every year. Weddings booked a year in advance, garden tours through private courtyards, candlelit walks that promise a scare and deliver a story. And here's the lie the city tells you, or at least the one it lets you assume, that the charm and the history are 2 different layers, one laid over the other, old stones, new paint. A dark past, safely sealed under a pretty surface you're invited to admire without looking underneath. That is not what Charleston is. The prettiness is not sitting on top of the history. It is built from the same material, doing the same job it always did, just with a different sign out front. Take the old Exchange building. It went up in 1771, a proud civic structure on the waterfront, an address that still books weddings today and still runs public tours through its upper rooms, brides posing on the front steps where merchants once did business with the British Crown. The tour takes you through high-ceilinged rooms, past display cases, down a staircase into the basement. And that basement is the sales pitch, the part every visitor is really there for. It's called the Provost Dungeon now, lit for effect, laid out with placards and reproduction shackles so you can picture what it held. What it actually held during the Revolutionary War were prisoners of war and captured patriots, packed into a low stone space with no ventilation and no sanitation. Men left to sit in their own filth for weeks, at a stretch while the war went on above their heads in the ordinary light of a working port city. Isaac Hayne was one of them, held there around 1781, a militia officer accused of breaking parole, and he was hanged without the benefit of a trial. No jury, no defense, a decision made and carried out by the men holding the building. The dungeon is part of the tour now. The building never stopped being what it was. It just added a gift shop. That is the pattern to watch for in everything that follows. Charleston did not tear down the machinery of its past and rebuild something gentler on the cleared lot. It kept the machinery. The courthouses that handed down hangings are still courthouses, or museums standing in the same footprint, or wedding venues with the original floor. The docks, the walls, the holding cells, repainted, relabeled, rented out for an evening. Not replaced, reused. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A city that buried its dark history and built something new on top would be a city trying to forget. Charleston did something else. It kept the structures standing, kept them working, and simply changed what it called the work. A prison becomes a tour stop. The hanging ground is a garden now, mowed and photographed. Down the block, the old jail pours drinks under its original exposed brick, and the bartender works the building's past into small talk worth a tip. The charm is not covering the history. The charm is the history, still in use. Notice what that means for you, standing on those streets with a camera or a wine glass or a ghost walk ticket in hand. You are not visiting a museum of what Charleston used to be. You are standing inside a building that is still doing its job. That is the trap. Not that Charleston hides what happened here. It is that Charleston never had to. It just kept the buildings open and changed the entrance fee. Charleston's charm was never an accident of good taste. It was built on top of a set of physical facts about the place, and those facts are the reason the city needed so many graveyards. Start with the ground itself. Charleston sits on a low peninsula wedged between the Ashley River and the Cooper River, and a large share of the buildable land under the historic district was not solid ground at all. It was marsh and swamp, drained and filled by enslaved labor to make room for the city colonists wanted. That drainage was never complete. Low-lying lots held standing water after every heavy rain, gutters and ditches ran slow or not at all, and the water table sat close enough to the surface that a dry season was the exception, not the rule. Marsh water does not drain the way high ground does. It sits and warms until it stagnates, and what it breeds in a subtropical port through the long wet summers is mosquitoes. In numbers colonists had no framework for understanding, let alone controlling. The port made it worse. Charleston's harbor did not just receive cargo, it received ships on a regular schedule arriving from the Caribbean and West Africa, carrying not only goods and enslaved people, but the insects and infections that traveled in barrels of standing water, in bilges, in the bodies of passengers already sick from the crossing. Every ship that tied up at the wharves was a small, moving reservoir of whatever disease had been circulating at its last port of call. A city built on drained swamp did not need bad luck to catch yellow fever. It needed a single infected mosquito or a single infected sailor stepping off a single ship into a summer already thick with standing water and biting insects. Charleston had that every season. That combination set the epidemiological clock running before Charleston was even 50 years old. In 1699, the first major yellow fever epidemic tore through the young colony, and it did not creep. It killed close to 15% of the entire colonial population within a matter of weeks. It did not spare rank or office either. It took out a meaningful share of the local government along with everyone else, which meant a colony barely a generation old was suddenly relearning who was in charge, in the middle of a summer nobody had been prepared for. Here is what yellow fever actually does to a body, because the name alone undersells it. It begins with a sudden high fever, chills, headache, and muscle pain. Symptoms indistinguishable at first from a dozen lesser illnesses. Within days, in serious cases, the fever breaks and seems to improve, and then returns harder. The virus attacks the liver, which is where the disease gets its name. Bilirubin builds in the blood, and the skin and eyes turn yellow, jaundiced. It attacks the kidneys next. And in the worst cases, it causes internal bleeding severe enough that victims vomit blood turned black by stomach acid, a symptom so consistent that the disease earned an older, blunter nickname in the ports it moved through: black vomit. Organ failure follows. There was no treatment in the 18th or 19th century that changed that progression in any meaningful way. Colonial physicians could bleed a patient, purge a patient, keep a patient cool and hydrated. None of it touched the virus itself. That was not a one-time disaster. Between 1699 and 1775, Charleston endured close to 60 major epidemics. Yellow fever, malaria, sometimes both moving through the population in the same season. More than 4,700 yellow fever deaths were formally recorded across that stretch alone, and the sickness did not stay in the colonial period and quietly exit. In 1858, more than 800 people died of yellow fever in a single season. In a city of roughly 40,000 residents, one death for every 50 people. In one summer, more than 150 years after the first outbreak had already proven the ground itself was the problem. Here is what that means in practice. A city built on drained swamp in a warm coastal climate, with a port constantly receiving ships from the Caribbean and West Africa, was never going to be spared this. The geography did not make epidemics possible. It made them scheduled. But disease was only the first mechanism. The second was commercial, and it was even larger in scale. Charleston's harbor made it one of the most valuable ports in British North America. And the same deep water access that brought in rice, indigo, and shipping. Traffic also brought in human beings sold as cargo. An estimated 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to what became the United States passed through the port of Charleston. Not some, not many, 4 in every 10. The international slave trade was formally banned in 1808. That did not end the business in Charleston. It moved the business indoors. Public street auctions of enslaved people were banned by the city itself in 1856. Not out of conscience, but because the spectacle had become an embarrassment to the image the city wanted to sell. So a businessman named Thomas Ryan opened a private auction gallery instead, out of public view, known as Ryan's Mart. Consider what that change actually meant for the people being sold. Moving the auction behind a wall did not change what happened inside it. Families were still separated on the auction block. People were still inspected, priced, and sold as property. The only thing that moved indoors was the discomfort of the people watching. The buyers and the city that hosted them no longer had to see the transaction from the street, so the transaction became easier to live alongside. It was not a reform, it was a redecoration. Ryan's Mart operated until Union troops occupied the city in 1865. The building still stands on Chalmers Street today, preserved as the Old Slave Mart Museum, the only building in South Carolina confirmed to have been built specifically as a slave auction house. It is a 2-minute walk from the restaurants of the historic market where tourists are eating lunch right now. Think about what that means for a city built on commerce like this. The trade wasn't hidden in the outskirts, dealt with at a discreet distance. It was moved a few blocks behind a door and kept running in the center of downtown for another 9 years. That is the second mechanism. An economy that did not stop when the law changed, it just found a smaller room. The third mechanism was bureaucratic. It is the part that turns death into paperwork. The Old City Jail opened in 1802 and operated for 137 years, closing only in 1939. Officials and historians estimate that roughly 14,000 people died within its walls over that span. Not that many executions, that is the part worth sitting with. The overwhelming majority of those deaths were not sentences carried out. They were disease, overcrowding, and neglect, the ordinary business of confining people in a structure that was never built to keep them alive. What that meant day to day was simple and grim, cells built for a fraction of the population they actually held. No isolation for the sick, which meant one case of fever or dysentery moved cell to cell with nothing to slow it. No resident medical staff worth the name, no ventilation suited to a Charleston summer, no accounting for the same swamp-bred mosquitoes that were killing people 2 blocks away in their own homes. A jail cell in this building was not a pause in a person's life. For thousands of people, it was the last enclosed space they ever occupied, and nobody outside was required to explain why. Public hangings did happen in the jail yard routinely for most of the 19th century, and the last one was carried out in 1911. But the hangings were the visible part. Nearly all of the dead in that jail were the quiet part, the part with no scaffold and no crowd. Just a cell and a slow outcome nobody bothered to record beyond a tally. A courthouse processes disputes. A jail in Charleston processed bodies and did it for over a century without the machinery ever needing to change. The fourth mechanism was not disease, not commerce, not law. It was etiquette. After the Revolutionary War, dueling became the accepted way for men of standing in Charleston to settle an insult. Not a crime to be prosecuted, not an embarrassment to be hidden, a custom to be honored, performed according to rules, between men who considered themselves the most civilized class the city had to offer. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of this mechanism. A city that built its identity around its steeples, around a reputation devout enough to earn the nickname the Holy City, also built a working, respected tradition of men shooting each other over insults to their pride, and made sure to do it where the churches could not see. The city had a specific place for it. Philadelphia Alley, a single block connecting Queen Street and Cumberland Street, known locally as Dueller's Alley. Local tradition holds that it was chosen for one reason. It was the one spot downtown where none of the city's many church steeples could see you. Privacy from the neighbors wasn't the point, and neither was distance from the law. The buildings representing the city's moral authority simply needed no line of sight to the killing. In a city built around visible faith, dueling required a blind spot, and Charleston had exactly one alley narrow enough to provide it. As many as 16 men are said to have died there in pistol duels across the 19th century, feet from the same churches whose bells rang for their funerals. 4 mechanisms, 4 completely different engines: biology, commerce, bureaucracy, and honor. They did not need to cooperate with each other to produce the same result. What they share is not cause, it is geometry. Charleston is small, dense, and self-contained, a peninsula a few miles across where the jail, the market, the dueling ground, and the church steeples all sit within easy walking distance of one another. Death here was never exiled to the edge of town. It was processed in the same rooms where people worshipped, shopped, and lived, efficiently, repeatedly, and without needing to be hidden, because there was nowhere else in the city for it to go. None of these 4 mechanisms required a villain working in secret. None of them required the city to conceal anything from itself. None of them ever had to be dismantled, only administered. A fever season, an auction ledger, a jail count, a dueling ground. Each one running on schedule in plain sight, inside a footprint small enough to walk across in an afternoon. That is what makes Charleston different from a city that simply has a violent past. The violence here was not an interruption to daily life. It was zoned into it, on the same streets, in the same buildings, under the same steeples, for 200 years. Most of what you've just heard happened in hundreds, sometimes thousands, spread out over decades. But one death in Charleston's history was so large, so public, and so deliberately staged that it does not fit alongside the others. It needs to be told on its own. On the morning of December 10th, 1718, 30 men were led out to a scaffold at White Point on the southern tip of the Charleston Peninsula. One of them was not like the others. Stade Bonnet had never worked a rigging line in his life. He was a wealthy landowner from Barbados, a former army major with a plantation, a wife, and no reason anyone could name for becoming a pirate, except by most accounts that reached Charleston, an unhappy marriage he wanted out of. That detail followed him everywhere. Real pirates stole their ships. Bonnet bought his. He purchased a sloop outright, named it Revenge, hired a crew, and sailed out of Barbados in 1717 like a man buying his way into a different life. Sailors who served under him and later testified said he barely understood naval command, that he deferred constantly to men who actually knew the sea, that at one point he even sailed briefly under Blackbeard rather than command alone. Charleston gave him a nickname before it gave him a sentence: the Gentleman Pirate. The Gentleman Act did not survive contact with the law. In September 1718, Bonnet and his crew were sailing off the coast of North Carolina when Colonel William Rhett caught up with them, following a tip that pirates were hiding in the Cape Fear River. A battle followed. Bonnet surrendered. He was brought back to Charleston to stand trial, and along the way he escaped custody once, slipping free before he was tracked down and recaptured on Sullivan's Island, just across the harbor from the city that meant to hang him. At trial, Bonnet did what a gentleman does. He wrote letters, he pleaded his rank, his property, his respectability, asking the court to see the difference between him and the crew he'd sailed with. Judge Nicholas Trott was not moved. Trott handed down the death sentence himself, and by December the appeals were exhausted. Bonnet went to the gallows at White Point on a cold Wednesday morning, hanged alongside 29 of his own men in a single execution. The hanging itself was not elaborate. A rope, a platform, a drop, a body left hanging for the crowd gathered along the waterfront to see. Charleston did not stage it as theater so much as proof. Proof that the city meant what it said about piracy, proof visible to every ship sailing past the harbor mouth. Bonnet's death was not unusual in method. It was unusual in what came before it and in what came after. Because Bonnet's hanging was not an isolated event. Over 5 weeks in the fall of 1718, Charleston hanged 49 pirates at that same gallows on the same stretch of shoreline. one of the largest mass pirate executions in American history, carried out in a colonial port that had decided, all at once, to make an example out of an entire criminal economy. The bodies were reportedly left on display near the harbor entrance afterward, strung up where incoming vessels could not avoid seeing them. 49 men, 5 weeks, one message repeated in bodies for every captain approaching the coast. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment. Charleston in 1718 had a population of perhaps 3,500 people. In the space of 5 weeks, the city executed enough pirates to fill a small neighborhood, and did it in the same public square, using the same gallows again and again until the message could not be missed by anyone arriving by sea. This was not a trial that ran its course. This was a machine built for one purpose, run at capacity for over a month straight. Stede Bonnet's story reads, on the surface, like the simplest justice. A criminal caught, tried, and hanged, exactly as the law promised. A pirate got a pirate's ending. But the gentleman detail complicates it. A landowner who bought a ship to escape a bad marriage does not fit the story Charleston wanted to tell about hardened criminals menacing the seas. He fit it anyway once the rope was around his neck. The city needed the deterrent more than it needed the truth of who he'd been before he became one. Today, White Point is called White Point Garden, and it looks nothing like a killing ground. It is a manicured park at the tip of the peninsula, oak trees strung with Spanish moss, antique cannons pointed out at the harbor, white gazebos positioned for exactly the photograph they now exist to produce. Brides walk down the same ground where 49 men were hanged in 5 weeks. Wedding parties pose beside the cannons, families spread, blankets under the oaks on weekend afternoons a few hundred feet from where the bodies were once left. Facing the water as a warning, there is a small monument at the site marking what happened there. It gives the date, the name, the basic facts. Most visitors walk past it without stopping to read it, on their way to better light for a photograph. Bonnet's death fits the story people expect from a pirate history: crime, capture, rope. The next one does not fit at all. It is the story of a man in Charleston who followed every rule of honor his society gave him, who did exactly what was expected of a gentleman defending his name, and ended up just as dead. That is the death that should unsettle you more. Joseph Brown Ladd arrived in Charleston in his mid-20s carrying a medical bag and a manuscript of poems. A newcomer trying to do 2 difficult things at once: build a physician's practice from nothing and make a name for himself as a writer in a city that already had its own literary circles, its own established doctors, its own way of deciding who belonged. Rhode Island was behind him. Charleston in 1786 was a society with rules he had not grown up inside. Rules about who a gentleman associated with, what he owed his reputation, and how a slight, once given, was supposed to be answered. A young professional new to the city learned those rules quickly because Charleston did not leave much room to learn them slowly. Insults were not settled with an apology and a handshake. They were settled on a fixed piece of ground at a fixed distance with pistols, and every man of Ladd's class understood that this was simply how it was done, regardless of how small the original offense had been. That is what happened to him. The dispute that led to his death was trivial, an exchange that, in almost any other circumstance, would have been forgotten within the week. But this was Charleston, and the code did not distinguish between grievances worth dying over and grievances that were not. Ralph Isaacs demanded satisfaction, and once that demand was made, Ladd's options collapsed to one. Refusing a challenge carried a death of its own, social death, the end of a reputation and a practice before either had properly begun. So Ladd, newly arrived, still building his name, agreed to Philadelphia Alley. Satisfaction was not a metaphor to men of that era. It was a procedure with fixed steps, a challenge issued and accepted, seconds appointed on both sides to negotiate terms and confirm the affair could not be settled short of pistols, a ground chosen, a distance paced off, a signal agreed upon. Within that procedure, there was a recognized option for a man who did not want blood on his hands: deloping, firing deliberately into the air or otherwise declining to aim at his opponent, while still standing his ground and taking the other man's fire. It was honorable. It was also a considerable risk, because it left a man exposed to a shot he had chosen not to answer in kind, trusting his opponent to either miss or, in the best case, extend the same mercy back. Ladd chose it. He raised his pistol and fired into the air deliberately, sparing Isaacs the injury or death he could otherwise have inflicted. It was not a symbolic gesture read into the record after the fact. Witnesses on the ground saw him do it and understood exactly what he was doing. Isaacs did not extend the same mercy. His shot was aimed and it struck Ladd in the leg. A leg wound, under the logic of the code, was not supposed to be a death sentence. The ritual was built around the idea that a hit settled the matter one way or another, quickly, honorably, and that a wounded man either recovered or he did not. But either way, the affair itself was concluded on the field. Not a clean kill. Not the fast, decisive outcome dueling was designed to produce. What actually killed Joseph Brown Ladd was not the pistol ball in his leg. It was what the pistol ball let in. Infection, in a decade with no real defense against it, once a deep wound began to turn. He was carried a few blocks from the alley to his lodgings on Church Street, and for a while it may have looked to the people around him like a wound a young and otherwise healthy man could survive. It did not stay that way. Over the following days, the wound worsened, the fever climbed, and Ladd, a trained physician who understood as well as anyone in that room what a spreading infection in an unclean wound meant in 1786, had every reason to understand his own prognosis as it declined. There was no sudden collapse, no single dramatic moment marking the end. There was a slow, conscious decline in a rented room, days of fever and deterioration, a young doctor watching his own body fail by the same signs he would have recognized in a patient. This is the case that should sit heavier than Bonnet's. Stede Bonnet chose piracy, chose the risks of capture, chose a path that at least lets the ending make sense on its own terms. Crime answered by consequence. Joseph Brown Ladd chose the opposite at every turn. He followed the code exactly as a gentleman was instructed to follow it. Restraint over a grievance. Too small to matter, mercy over the man who challenged him, honor over the appetite for violence. The whole ritual was supposedly designed to channel and contain. He did not gamble with anyone else's life. He gambled only with his own, on the assumption that the code he was trusting would treat his mercy as most codes claim to, as protection. It did not. The mechanism did not care that he had done everything right. It killed him anyway, slowly, in a rented room a few blocks from where he had made his mercy shot. And that is the point worth sitting with. A system of honor that punishes the men who follow it as readily as the men who abuse it is not really a system of honor at all. It is simply a mechanism, indifferent to the character of the man caught inside it. Residents and passers-by near Church Street and Philadelphia Alley still report hearing whistling late at night. Ladd was known in life for whistling to himself, an idle, unremarkable habit, a detail that only means anything in hindsight. It is a small thing to hang a haunting on. People hang it there anyway. Mid-roll CTA. And if you're finding this breakdown valuable, take a second to subscribe. This channel goes deep on one deadly American place at a time. Picture the arrival the way the legend tells it. A traveler comes up the road from the south in the last hour of daylight, 6 miles still between him and Charleston, the horse tired, the light going. The 6-mile house rises up out of the dark pines. 3 stories, lamplit windows, smoke from the chimney. The first real promise of rest since sunup. Lavinia Fisher meets him at the door herself. She is young, she is warm, she asks about his journey like she has been waiting all day just to hear it. She brings the tea without being asked twice. That is the version passed down on the ghost tours, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before it gets taken apart, because the reason it has survived 200 years is that it works as a story. The tea is the hinge of it, hospitality turned into a weapon, kindness as an instrument. The traveler drinks, and drowsiness comes on faster than the road should account for. Somewhere past midnight, in the version passed down at the jail's ticket counter, John Fisher climbs the stairs, and what happens next happens quietly. A lever by the bed, a section of floor that isn't floor at all. The body goes down into a basement that has been swallowing travelers for longer than anyone at the inn admits, and by morning there is a bed for the next arrival and no evidence of the last one. Some tellings put the number of dead above a dozen. A few push higher. None of them agree on an exact figure, which is itself worth noticing. A true crime tends to have a fixed body count. A myth's body count grows with each teller. It is a good story. It has a beautiful, dangerous woman at the center of it, a domestic space turned into a trap, a mechanical horror hidden under an ordinary floor, and a moral shape, evil hiding behind hospitality, that audiences recognize instantly. It asks almost nothing of the listener except to be frightened, and it delivers that fear efficiently. None of that makes it true. On February 18th, 1820, Lavinia Fisher and her husband John were hanged together in Charleston. That part is real, documented, and not in dispute. What happened in the 2 centuries after their deaths is where the story stops being history and starts being product. Ghost tour operators built walking routes around the old city jail and the site of the old inn because a tour needs a story with a hook, and seductress serial killer is a far better hook than convicted robber. Guidebooks repeated the trap door and the poison tea because earlier guidebooks had repeated them, each new edition treating the last one as its source rather than going back to the trial record. Plaques went up. Word of mouth did the rest. None of this required a conspiracy or a villain. It required only an industry built on selling fright to visitors on a schedule, where a compelling story that draws a crowd will always outcompete an accurate one that doesn't, and where nobody along the chain had much incentive to go check the courthouse. Not murder, highway robbery. That is the actual charge on the actual surviving trial record. In May 1819, a jury convicted John and Lavinia Fisher of robbing a traveler on the road near their inn, not a body count. There was no confession to killing anyone, and no murder charge was ever entered against either of them at any point in the proceedings. The most repeated fact about Lavinia Fisher, the fact that gives her the title she is marketed under to this day, is not what a Charleston jury ever found her guilty of. Verifying that took actual archival labor, and it is worth describing what that labor looks like because it is the opposite of what built the myth. Nick Butler, a historian with the Charleston County Public Library, has spent years working through the fragile, handwritten 19th century documents connected to the case. Trial records that were never digitized for easy searching, newspaper accounts from a period when papers covered court proceedings in a few dense paragraphs and moved on, property records for the inn itself. Bruce Orr, a former homicide detective, brought an investigator's method to the same material for a book he wrote on the Fishers, cross-referencing every surviving document against every other one, the way a cold case detective checks one witness statement against another. This is slow, unglamorous work. It means reading brittle paper instead of repeating a plaque. It means finding out what a document does not say, which is a harder thing to report than what a legend claims it says. Both researchers, working independently through the same category of primary sources, arrived at the same conclusion. There is no hard evidence that Lavinia Fisher ever killed anyone. Only 2 bodies were ever connected to the 6 Mile House case in any surviving record, and even those 2 were never conclusively tied to the Fishers by the court that actually tried them. 2 bodies, not a basement full. A robbery conviction, not a murder trial. That is the entire evidentiary foundation beneath a legend that has run for 200 years. The trapdoor deserves its own accounting because it is the single most cinematic detail in the whole story, and it could not have existed. Homes and inns across the South Carolina Lowcountry are built without basements, and this is not a quirk of the 6 Mile House specifically. It is a feature of the region's hydrology. The water table across the coastal Lowcountry sits high enough that digging down more than a few feet brings up standing water before it brings up a usable foundation. Builders in Charleston and the surrounding country worked around this for generations by raising structures up rather than digging them down. Houses set on raised foundations, crawl spaces instead of cellars, storage built above ground instead of below it. A trapdoor leading to a subterranean chamber stacked with bodies is not merely undocumented at the 6 Mile House. It is close to physically impossible given what the ground beneath the inn would have allowed. The single image most responsible for making this story frightening, the hidden basement of corpses beneath an ordinary floor, is also the detail the region's own geology rules out. The wedding dress survives the same test no better, though it is a smaller lie doing quieter work. The story holds that Lavinia climbed the gallows steps in a wedding dress, a final act of theater from a woman who staged her own death as a performance. Beautiful, defiant, in white, refusing to go quietly. It is a striking image, and it is exactly the detail a story needs to make its central figure unforgettable rather than merely guilty. The truth is administrative rather than theatrical. The white garment she wore was the standard robe issued to every condemned prisoner of the period, man or woman, hanged for robbery or anything else the courts of the day sent someone to the gallows for. It was not a costume she chose, it was a uniform the state provided. A defiant bride facing death on her own terms makes a better tour stop than a convicted robber wearing what everyone else in her position also wore that year. Strip away the tea, the trapdoor, the dress, and the inflated body count, and what is left is smaller than the legend, but still genuinely notable. Lavinia Fisher was the first woman executed in South Carolina for a capital crime that was not murder. That is a real historical distinction, and it says something worth knowing about how the state applied capital punishment in 1820. About how far the law was willing to reach for a robbery conviction, about a young woman going to the gallows for a crime that, committed by almost anyone else, might not have ended there. It is a fact about the machinery of early American justice. It is not, on its own, dramatic enough to sell a ticket. If the title Lavinia Fisher has worn for 2 centuries actually belongs to anyone, it is Jane Toppin, a nurse who confessed to 31 murders in 1901, more than 80 years after the Fishers were hanged. Toppin's case has what Fishers never did: a confession, a documented method, a body count that came from the killer's own mouth rather than from 2 centuries of embellishment. And almost no one outside serious true crime readers has heard her name. That asymmetry is the real story here. A woman who very likely killed no one has been marketed globally as a serial killer for 200 years. A woman who confessed to 31 killings is a footnote. The myth won not because the evidence supported it, but because an inn on a dark road, a pretty young hostess, and a cup of tea make a better 90-second stop on a walking tour than a nurse's confession read out of a court transcript. That is the trade this city keeps making, story for story. The robber gets sold as a seductress. Everything else about the case bends the same way. The burial robe turns into a wedding dress. The geological impossibility becomes the most quoted detail in the whole legend, until the myth simply fits better than the record does, and a real serial killer, 31 confessed victims and all, goes almost entirely unremembered while Charleston sells tickets to a woman who probably killed no one at all. 200 years of ghost tours built an industry on a robbery conviction. And today, her name draws more visitors through the Old City Jail than all the people who actually died inside its walls of disease and neglect combined. They have no names on the tour, no plaque with their likeness, no gift shop version of their story, no reason for a guide to slow down at their part of the building. The most profitable ghost at the Old City Jail belongs to someone who was, by the actual court record, guilty of theft. That is one story, corrected. The pattern underneath it is bigger than one woman, one inn, one myth. And it's the same pattern running through every case this video has covered so far. The system does not have a face, it does not have a name. That is what makes it a system and not a story. Look back at what has actually been established. 29 pirates hanged together in a single morning. Dozens more died over a conspiracy that never got past late-night meetings. A young man was killed by the gentler outcome of a duel, the one where he showed mercy, and a woman convicted of nothing worse than robbery got remade by legend into something she never was. Underneath all of them, unnamed, unnumbered in any monument, sit the dead of a single jail. More of them than the city has ever put a name to, gone to fever, neglect, and time. None of these were isolated tragedies. None of them were Charleston's bad luck. They were outputs. Different names, different decades, same machine. A pirate, a conspirator, a duelist, a woman turned into folklore. Swap out the century and the costume, and the shape of what happened to them barely changes. For close to 250 years, that machine ran on schedule. It hanged people as scheduled civic entertainment, crowds gathered at White Point to watch. It sold human beings as scheduled commerce, indoors, out of the weather, on Chalmers Street, so the business of the port wouldn't be disrupted by rain. It counted epidemic death as an acceptable operating cost of a harbor that made this city rich. Every institution you've heard about in this video, the dungeon, the jail, the market, the dueling ground, existed because efficient, public, profitable death was the point, not the byproduct. That is the pattern, not ghosts, infrastructure. And here's the part that should sit with you longer than any single execution or any single fever season. The hauntings people report in Charleston today are not spread evenly across the city. They are not random noise, a knock here, a cold spot there, scattered by chance across 300 years of a busy port town. Plot every reported haunting on a map, and it lands, almost without exception, on top of the machine itself. The jail, the dungeon under the exchange, the site of the auction house, the alley where the duels were fought, the graveyards ringing the church steeples that gave this city its nickname, the ones that made it look, from the harbor, like a place at peace with itself. Draw that map once and you stop seeing a haunted city. You start seeing a floor plan, the layout of a business that dealt in bodies and never had to itemize the cost. That overlap is not a coincidence, and it is not a coincidence dressed up as one for a tour brochure. It is a map. It shows you exactly where the deaths were processed and exactly where they were never fully accounted for. A ghost story, stripped of its theatrics, is usually just an unresolved ledger entry. Someone who died in volume in a place built to produce volume without a name attached to the count. So the ghost stories told on this peninsula every night, one lantern tour after another, are not dozens of separate mysteries. They are one mystery, told over and over from a dozen different angles, because the city has never had to answer for it as one thing. Change the guide, change the street, change the century the story is set in. The underlying question never changes. Who died here? Why did it happen so many times? And why was it allowed to keep happening? We started this video with a man hanged in 1822. It's time to go back to him, because his story isn't just where this began, it's where the whole machine shows its work. The old city jail is still standing, and it is still on the tour route. Visitors report cold spots and disembodied voices concentrated in the old cell blocks. A chill that people describe as localized, a few feet wide, gone as soon as you step past it. Those spots cluster in the wings where the historical record shows the highest density of death. Not violence, disease, neglect. 14,000 people, dying of fever and starvation and dysentery behind those walls, and the cold a modern visitor feels standing in that hallway lines up, wing for wing, with the ledgers. A few blocks away, the Battery Carriage House Inn sits near what used to be the dueling grounds. The same stretch of turf where men like Joseph Brown Ladd bled out over points of honor nobody remembers today. Guests there report a man in old-fashioned dress walking the upstairs rooms, doors opening and closing with no one behind them, footsteps in a hallway that dead ends at a wall. The inn calls him the gentleman ghost. Some guests say he sits at the foot of the bed. The historical record calls him a category, one more name added to the duel count on ground that already had one. A formal contest with a script and a result, repeating itself for an audience that pays to stay the night. Poogan's Porch has served dinner since 1976 in a Victorian house built in 1888. The story attached to it is Zoe St. Amand, a real woman, a schoolteacher who spent decades of her life in that house with her sister, unmarried, the two of them keeping the place long after the neighborhood changed around them until she died in a nursing home in 1954. Guests and staff report glasses sliding, furniture shifted, on every floor of the restaurant. She is not folklore. She is a name in a census record and a death certificate, doing exactly what the house's marketing wants her to do. Linger decades after the woman herself left. At the Unitarian Church graveyard, one of the oldest burying grounds in the city, headstones leaning into each other under trees nobody has trimmed in a century. Locals point out an unmarked plot they call Annabel Lee, tied by legend to the Poe poem written after his own time stationed in Charleston. That connection is folklore, not documentation. No church record ties that plot to that poem, no correspondence, no diary entry. But the story survives every retelling because an unmarked grave with a famous name attached sells better on a night tour than an unmarked grave with no name at all. And because not knowing who is actually buried there is, in its own way, the truest thing on the tour. Which brings us back to him. Denmark Vesey. What he wanted was not complicated. He wanted freedom. For himself, already free, and for the people around him who were not. That is the whole of it. No manifesto, no plot to burn the city for its own sake. A carpenter who built a congregation and tried to build a way out of bondage for people he worshipped alongside every week. After they hanged him, the city's authorities burned his church to the ground, as if the building itself had been the offense. It did not stay burned. It was rebuilt and rebuilt again after that, and it stands today under the name Mother Emanuel, still holding services every week, still gathering a congregation on the same ground where a free man once stood trial for the crime of wanting freedom for others. The city that executed him could not keep the church down. That is not a metaphor. That is a fact about a building's address. Here is the thing to sit with. Charleston's history was never hidden. It was repainted, renamed, and sold back to you as atmosphere. The cold spots, the gentleman in old clothes, the schoolteacher moving glasses, the unmarked grave with a poet's name attached to it, none of it is invented from nothing. Every one of those stories has a name and a date sitting in a court record or a church ledger, filed in daylight, decades before anyone thought to charge admission for it after dark. The city did not need to erase what happened here. It only needed to make it pretty enough that you'd stop asking. The tour guide will tell you the house is haunted. The record will tell you who died there and why and how many more died the same way one street over. Both of them are true. Only one of them is being sold to you as entertainment. Outro? If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real ground and the real people behind the sea. Postcard. There's another American place on screen right now with a body count most visitors never learn about either. Watch that one next. 1. Total hanged in the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy. Script states as many as 35 men. Sources diverge. Some cite 34 additional after Vesey. Others cite 41 total executed. 2. Isaac Haynes' detention date in the Provost dungeon, given as around 1781. Not independently confirmed in this research pass. 3. Isaac Haynes' trial status, stated as hanged without the benefit of a trial. Needs a direct primary source check before final publication. 4. Yellow fever death count, 1699 to 1775. More than 4,700 is the recorded figure cited, but exact sourcing/methodology unclear. 5. Old City Jail total deaths, approximately 14,000, 1802 to 1939, widely repeated by tour operators and secondary sources, exact original sourcing unclear. 6. 1718. Charleston population, approximately 3,500, approximate, not tied to a specific census or record in this research pass. 7. Annabelle Lee Grave / Edgar Allan Poe connection. Confirmed folklore, not documented fact, flagged as such in the script itself.